NASA spent billions building a space station and then discovered it could not schedule its astronauts the way it scheduled its hardware. That sounds like the setup for a myth. In popular retellings, Skylab 4 became the mission where astronauts went on strike in space. Yet NASA's own historical review tells a different story. John Urey of the NASA History Office found no documented mutiny, no formal strike, no crew seizing control of a spacecraft. What the records do show is something more unsettling. Trust broke down. And it broke down inside one of the most controlled working environments ever created. The image most people remember is silence. A headset, a radio link, a crew supposedly refusing to talk. But before there was silence, there was a schedule. A thick printed timeline covered with tasks, experiments, maintenance, exercise periods, observations, reports, and checklists. Every hour had a destination. Every activity had a place. When Skylab 4 launched in late 1973, the crew entered an 84-day mission. The station itself was a success. The hardware worked, the experiments were valuable. New objectives had been added during preparation. Expectations grew. And so did the schedule. On paper, the plan looked efficient. Viewed another way, the schedule itself was becoming the mission. The astronauts floated through Skylab's vast interior, carrying cameras, collecting data, exercising to preserve their health, maintaining equipment, and conducting observations of Earth and the Sun. The timeline assumed that adaptation to life in orbit would happen quickly. It assumed transitions between tasks would be smooth. The planner on the ground could move from one line of text to the next instantly. An astronaut could not. The difference seems small until every hour depends on it. The mission moved forward. The crew worked. Experiments were completed. Yet something strange appeared inside the records. They were falling behind. Not dramatically. Not catastrophically. Just enough for concern to grow. A task slipped here. Another slipped there. Time reserves disappeared. Unfinished work accumulated at the edges of the schedule. The obvious explanation seemed reasonable. The Skylab 4 crew were all first-time space travelers. Perhaps they simply needed more experience. Perhaps they were not performing at the level expected. That explanation fit the numbers. At least for a while. The problem was that more effort was not fixing it. The crew worked longer. The backlog remained. The dense mission timeline kept returning like an unwanted object drifting back into view. The station looked successful. The schedule did not. And that raised a more dangerous possibility. What if the astronauts were not failing the plan? What if the plan was failing the astronauts? The first clues appeared in requests. Requests for relief. Requests for adjustments. Requests for more realistic pacing. The messages traveled through communication links connecting orbit to Earth. The responses that came back did not fully address the underlying concern. Schedules continued arriving. Tasks continued accumulating. Pressure continued building. Inside Skylab, the crew could see the growing mismatch every day. On the ground, planners could see missed objectives and delayed activities. Both sides were looking at the same mission. They were beginning to draw different conclusions from it. That difference mattered because authority in space depends on trust. Mission control does not physically operate the station. The crew does. As long as both sides trust the assumptions behind the plan, command works smoothly. When trust starts disappearing, every instruction carries new weight. Every delay becomes evidence. Every request becomes a test. The headset connecting orbit and Earth remained active. But the relationship carried through that headset was changing. The conflict did not arrive in a single dramatic moment. It accumulated. A revised schedule arrived. More work followed. Additional expectations appeared. The astronauts continued reporting concerns. The concerns continued returning. The records increasingly reveal a workplace under strain rather than a rebellion in progress. The remarkable part is where this workplace happened to exist. Nobody could leave. The managers were on Earth. The workers were orbiting hundreds of miles above them. Neither side had another room to walk into. Neither side could end the relationship. The station itself became the meeting room. As December approached its final days, the pressure reached a point where the existing arrangement could not continue unchanged. Popular retellings often compress this period into a simple story about radio silence. Reality appears messier. Some communication incidents occurred. Accounts differ on exactly how specific moments unfolded. Historians continue to separate later myth from contemporary records. What is clearer is the larger pattern. The conflict was no longer about individual tasks. It was about authority. Not whether Mission Control possessed authority. Whether that authority still produced cooperation. Those are not the same thing. Near the end of December, a formal conference connected the crew and the ground. The physical image is surprisingly ordinary. No alarms. No emergency lights. Just voices traveling through communication equipment. Yet the conversation represented something rare. Operational authority was becoming negotiable inside a spacecraft. The astronauts explained the workload problem from their perspective. Mission personnel listened. The schedule itself came under examination. For weeks, pressure had been applied through planning. Now the planning process was being questioned. The confrontation many people imagine as a mutiny was actually something more revealing. A negotiation. The question hanging over that discussion was simple. If NASA loosened control, would performance become worse? The fear was understandable. Spaceflight depends on discipline. Relaxing oversight sounded risky. The revised approach moved in the opposite direction. More autonomy. Greater crew input. More realistic pacing. The dense printed timeline that had dominated the mission began to change. Then something happened that challenged the assumptions behind the original system. Productivity improved. The backlog eased. Performance strengthened. The crew completed substantial mission objectives. The station did not become less effective. In important ways, it became more effective. That result trapped the old explanation. If the astronauts had simply been unwilling to work, increased autonomy should have reduced output. If the astronauts had simply been inexperienced, changing the relationship should not have mattered so much. Yet performance improved after the scheduling relationship changed. The evidence pointed somewhere uncomfortable. The management system itself had contributed to the problem. The mission eventually ended. The station remained a technical success. The crew returned home. The myth survived. Stories about a strike in space continued spreading because they were easy to tell. 3 astronauts rebel against NASA. Simple. Memorable. Dramatic. The documented reality is less dramatic and far more useful. NASA's own reviews and the accounts of people involved increasingly pointed toward planning assumptions, workload design, and trust. The lesson carried forward into future operations. Crew autonomy received greater consideration. Scheduling practices evolved. Managers became more attentive to the realities of human performance during long missions. The conflict was not treated as proof that astronauts could not be trusted. It became evidence that trust had to flow both directions. That is why the famous story matters. Not because astronauts supposedly went on strike. Because a productivity system became so optimized that it stopped seeing the people expected to operate inside it. The opening image was a mission schedule. Line after line. Hour after hour. A document designed to impose order on a spacecraft circling Earth. By the end of the story, that same schedule meant something different. It was no longer proof of control. It was evidence of a limit. NASA could command the station. NASA could design the hardware. NASA could write the timeline. But Skylab revealed something the paperwork could not. Human performance could not be managed with the precision of machinery. And once that reality became visible, the schedule had to change.